This conference will now be recorded.
All right, I was successful. There we go.
Thanks, Stephen. When we think about Jesus, we understand that he has changed the world in a way that no one else ever has. We would be hard pressed to really find anywhere in the world that did not know about Jesus. Now, they might not know everything about him or maybe not know much about him, but the name Jesus is throughout the entire earth. His name is known. And we think about so many people who believe in Jesus, but yet we've got all of these different ways that he's believed in. And so when we make an audacious statement like Jesus is the way to salvation, it's really important that we understand who we're talking about and what we're talking about. And so, as Stephen mentioned, this is going to be a series of 3 studies, the first of which is going to introduce us to Jesus. Who is Jesus? Who are we talking about here? And the way that I'd like to begin this particular part of our study is to put these pictures up on the screen for you to look at. And if I were to ask you the question, which one of these is Jesus? Now, most of you would try to smell a rat in this and you'd say, okay, this is a trick, but let's just take all that out of it. No trick here. And I were to say, okay, which one of these is Jesus? Now, there'd be 2 ways we could go about it. We could say, all right, let's go through the process of elimination. And we might look at this one, this particular painting, and we would say, well, this isn't Jesus. I know who this is. This is George Washington. He's the father of our country. And if we're really up on our history, we might go to this one and say, well, I know this one's not Jesus because this is King Henry VIII of Great Britain. We could do it that way. We could go through that process. But for the most part, we wouldn't have to do that, would we? We would immediately say, okay, this is Jesus. This is him because we know what he looks like. We've seen these paintings all our lives, and this particular artist really wanted to make sure we knew it was Jesus, and this kind of aura or halo was put around his head, and the artist put a lamb in his arms to show us how gentle he is. So if I were to ask that question to almost anybody, immediately they would go to this particular painting to be Jesus. And it's interesting, isn't it? Let me take this and put it with a few others that have been developed to give us a rendering of what Jesus looked like. And it's interesting that all of these paintings have something in common. And certainly the ones on the screen that you can see have this in common. And it's the fact that they make Jesus look very weak. These bottom 2 paintings are Jesus at the time of his crucifixion. The one, as you're looking at your screen on the bottom left, gives this emaciated appearance of Jesus. The other one on the left gives us a picture of Jesus looking very weak. Then we go back to the top, though, and we're going into a season where we're going to see lots of depictions of baby Jesus. Then I've got the one that we started out with. So you look at all of these paintings, and every one of them is non-threatening. There is no one of these that we would go to and say, wow, this one just troubles me because Jesus looks so aggressive. No, none of that. And if we think about the primary 2 times in Jesus' life that artists try to render in a painting, it would be his birth and it would be his death. Because those are the 2 occasions in his life when Jesus is the most non-threatening of all. When he's this tiny little infant and oftentimes depicted with his mother Mary, or the time when he's about to go, or he's being nailed, or he has been nailed to the cross. These are occasions when Jesus just does not trouble us at all. And those are going to be the majority of the paintings that we find. But bear with me through one more slide. If I were to put these 2 pictures up, and I were to ask the question, which one looks the most like Jesus? Well, again, I think most people would say it's the one on the left. It's this one with the halo. It's the one with the lamb and Jesus with the long hair. But I want you to look at the other picture that's up there. This is not a painting. If I understand correctly, this was developed by anthropologists or people of that ilk anyway. And what they did is they took a sampling of skulls that had been found on skeletons of men from the 1st century. And they took the measurements of these skulls, and kind of like in a crime lab where the lab technician for the policeman is trying to develop who this person is who was murdered, they took all of these skulls and they made a composite of them. And through computer technology, they filled in all of the details of what the average 1st century Jew would have looked like. And so this is not to say that this depiction is what Jesus looked like, but what it is to say is this is what the average, the typical Jewish man who lived in the 1st century would have looked like. This would be the composite. How do you feel about that? You look at the composite, and that is not our impression of Jesus, is it? And that's because artists who were primarily Western artists, Western civilization artists, over the many, many years that Jesus, these depictions have been painted, have made him look like a Westerner. And so you think about the Jesus who's depicted here holding the lamb. If we took the lamb out of his arms and we put him in a cardigan sweater and maybe clipped his hair up a little bit, we would have somebody who would look like an American. You would put this person here and we would think this is a typical looking American. The white complexion, the long face, the eyes, everything about it, right? And so in our minds, we kind of automatically go to this impression of Jesus rather than thinking, okay, well, the man on the right might be what Jesus would have more likely looked like. Now, why do I bring all of this up? I bring all of this up just simply to say, many times if we are not careful, we have a stereotype of Jesus. In our minds, we have developed not only what we think he looks like based on all these artist renditions, but we also have this mindset of saying this is who Jesus was, when maybe that's not exactly right. Jesus made a very bold claim in John chapter 14. He's talking with his disciples, and the time is approaching when he's going to be crucified and leave the earth. And so the Apostle Thomas has made a statement to Jesus, and he said, look, just show us the way to the Father, just show us who he is, and we're going to be satisfied. And Jesus responds to his apostles, and he says this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It may have been that you've heard this verse your entire life, and it's lost some of its punch. And so what I've tried to do by putting it on the screen is to make these in this particular verse very emphatic. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And then very exclusively, once again, he says, no one comes to the Father except through me. I want you to think about the boldness of this statement. Jesus is saying there may be lots of people teaching lots of things about a lot of saviors. But he says, if you want to know the truth of the matter, this is the truth. I am the only way to the Father. It may be that as you've driven, you've been sitting behind a car that has a bumper sticker that looks something like this, and you see the word coexist. But yet within the depiction here, there's all of these different religious and cultural symbols. And so the point of this is we just need to all get along. We're all here on earth. We just need to all get along. Well, I can agree with that to an extent. If we're talking about how we need to treat other people, that is absolutely right. I am not going to hate anyone who is of another religion. I'm not going to hate anyone who has chosen some kind of cultural lifestyle. So I certainly can coexist when I think about how others are to be treated. However, when I come to matters of salvation, it's an entirely different story. And I tend to believe that those who have these bumper stickers or who wear shirts with this depiction on them are not only talking about how we treat one another, but we're also talking about matters of salvation. That you need to be happy with Jesus, and you need to let some people be happy with Muhammad, and you need to let some people be happy with Judaism, and we can all just get along. And it's at that point I must disagree. But I don't disagree because of something that I am. I disagree with that because of what Jesus has said. Jesus said, I am the only way. There is no other way of salvation except through me. And so when I come to believe in Jesus, I'm coming to believe in someone who is confrontational. This statement is not that Jesus who's holding the lamb with the rather weak expression on his face. This is the Jesus who is saying to us in very emphatic terms, if you want to find salvation, it is going to be through me and through me alone. And I've got to come to terms with that. I've got to understand what he's saying here. And so it is vital that as I think about these things, that I am looking to find who the real Jesus is. You as well as I know, I'm not going to find the real Jesus on canvas because there was no painting ever done of Jesus. He never sat and posed for an artist to get his depiction to send down through the ages. But I also have to understand that he's not going to be found in pop culture. There are a lot of folks preaching a lot of different Jesuses today. We can have the hard-nosed Jesus who's angry at everybody. We can have the soft Jesus who's angry at no one. We can have the Jesus who says, you just come to me and it's okay. There's nothing you have to change. I'm not going to find Jesus in any of those depictions, nor am I going to find him in the cultural trends that are going on in the world. The only place that I'm going to find the real Jesus is when I turn to the Word of God. God has made sure that the depiction of Jesus that I need to see is firmly ensconced within his Word. And so that's why it's so important that when I think about Jesus, I'm not being influenced by other people's views of Jesus. I'm not being influenced by all of these popular trends about Jesus. I am being influenced by the inspired Word of God that for 2,000 years has given a solid and unchanging picture of who Jesus is all about. So when I open my Bible to the story of Jesus. I open my Bible to the story of salvation. And what I understand is that when I begin on the first page of the Bible, I'm going to begin working my way through to the time that I get to the last page of the Bible. I have the picture of Jesus that God wants me to have. So let me illustrate it this way. If you remember your fairy tales, there's a story of Hansel and Gretel. And you'll recall within this story that in order to not get lost, these two leave a trail of breadcrumbs. And that story is so well known that the breadcrumb trail is still, all these years later, somewhat ensconced in our imaginations. And so we may even talk about leaving a breadcrumb trail as we think about telling somebody the way to arrive at a conclusion. Now, if you remember the story, it didn't work out too well for Hansel and Gretel. A bird comes along, eats up all of the breadcrumbs. So we're going to forget about that part. I want to use this, though, as kind of an illustration of Jesus in the Bible. When you begin in the book of Genesis, you don't have to turn very far to begin picking up on this trail that God is giving us that's leading us to Jesus. It's not going to be like Hansel and Gretel, where a bird comes along and eats up all of the evidence. No, what we're going to find is that within the Bible, we're going to have this picture that begins in the Old Testament, but in a very foggy way. But yet it's kind of like those breadcrumbs that God has dropped, that if we'll follow, we're going to find exactly who Jesus is. So we think about our Bible being divided into two different sections. About 3/4 of our Bible is what we call the Old Testament. This would have been what the Jews would have read. This is written by Jews, for Jews, about Jews. But yet all through the Old Testament, we start finding these evidences of Jesus. And so we might describe it this way, that we're seeing shadows of Jesus in the Old Testament. So let's just kind of think about that illustration. If I look at a shadow, there are certain things I can tell based on the shadow and the time of day. I can almost figure out the size of whatever's casting that shadow. And there may be certain features, I might be able to make out a head or raised arms, or, maybe I can make out the legs. But yet what I also have to realize about that shadow is that there's a lot of detail that I'm not going to get. While I'm making it a relative size, or I can make out the head, the arms, whatever, there's going to be a whole lot of that shadow that's going to be somewhat hidden from me. So I want you to think about that with these passages that we find about Jesus. If I had never read the New Testament and I start looking in the Old Testament, I'm going to see that there's somebody who's coming, but yet I don't know all of the details about this somebody who's coming. So let me just give you some examples of that. Perhaps our first reference of Jesus in the Bible is found not very far at all in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. This is a really important chapter of the Bible because this is where the first sin is committed. So in other words, this is the first time that in the history of mankind, which is really, really short in Genesis 3, humans have made the decision to defy God. And that comes with a price. And so after God tells us about the sin of man and woman, Adam and Eve, who are the first humans, he then begins meting out the punishments. And he talks about Adam and the punishment that he's going to receive, and Eve and the punishment she's going to receive. But we're also introduced to one who God identifies as a serpent. And God also pronounces a curse on the serpent. And this is what we're reading here in verse 15. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That is pretty deplete of specifics, isn't it? We look at this, and we've got a he, and we know that this he is going to do something to this serpent that sounds pretty bad, and the serpent is going to do something to the he that also sounds kind of bad, not as bad as what he's going to do to the serpent. But then God just changes subject. God just leaves us there. And so we look at this and we're left with the question. It's like, okay, I'm kind of getting this fuzzy picture. I'm seeing this breadcrumb. I'm seeing this shadow, but I don't know very much about him at all. And God says, okay, next. And he moves us on to the next story. Well, we go a little bit further in the book of Genesis, and we come to chapter 12. And chapter 12 has introduced us to a man by the name of Abraham, who is going to become a major, major figure in the Bible. And so as God is introducing himself to Abraham and introducing Abraham to us, he records these promises that he's making. And he says to Abraham, okay, I'm going to give you this big family, and I'm going to give your family a place where they can live. But then we come to verse 3, and he says, I will bless those who bless you. Okay, so he tells us that. And he says, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And then he makes this statement, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All right, so we start figuring out Abraham's a pretty big deal, and his family is going to be a big deal. But then he says, all of the families of the earth are going to be blessed through your descendants, and in particular, one descendant. And so in Genesis 3, we've got this one who is going to bruise the head of the serpent. And in Genesis 12, we've got this one through whom all the families of the earth are going to be blessed, but we're still only seeing shadows, aren't we? Well, we skip over a little bit in the Bible. We come to the book of Deuteronomy. And here's a man by the name of Moses, who's talking now to the family of Abraham, who has grown to a huge size, the people of Israel. And Moses, as he's about to die and giving his final addresses, says this, the Lord your God will raise up from the prophet for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. All right, so here I've got the first 5 books of the Bible, somebody who's going to bruise the head of the serpent, somebody through whom all the families of the earth are going to be blessed, somebody who's going to be like Moses, but seems to be greater because Moses himself is saying, God's going to raise up this prophet and you better listen to him. So I'm getting these details. And as I continue to follow this breadcrumb trail, I'm getting more of a picture, but I'm still not quite there. Now, as I continue through the Old Testament, I'm going to begin to find more information about this one. When I get to the book of Psalms, for example, there is going to be a lot spoken about this one who's going to bruise Satan's head, through whom everyone's going to be blessed, who's going to be a prophet like Moses, to whom everyone should listen. And we start then to introduce ourselves to a style of writing that's called messianic. And simply what that means is, it is writings about a Savior, an anointed one who's going to come as the Messiah. And the Psalms are going to be filled with all kinds of information about this Messiah. Let me give you just one example of that. When we come to Psalm 22, we find in this messianic psalm that it starts out by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that sounds very strange, doesn't it? If we're talking about one who God is going to send and is going to bless the earth, what's all this business about being forsaken? Well, that's going to become much more apparent as we continue on in our story of the Bible. And that's just one example. I could go through the book of Psalms and I find all of these details about this Messiah who's going to come, but still the shadow remains. But then I get to the end of the Old Testament, and there's all of these books, some of them very long, some of them very short. And we find out that the ones who wrote these books are prophets. These were Israel's teachers. These were men who God commissioned at various times in Israel's history to go in and to preach the message to them. And as they preached this message to Israel, they would oftentimes speak of punishment that's coming because Israel has defied God. Yet almost every one of these prophets also has a message that has a ray of hope. They say, look, one day somebody's going to come and he's going to bring light to the world. All right, our lights start coming on then, right? The light bulb starts coming on. Oh, okay. There was somebody in Genesis 3 who was going to bruise the head of the tempter, And there's somebody in Genesis 12 who is going to come through Abraham's family, but yet the earth is going to be blessed. And Moses said there's somebody who God's going to raise up. Okay, and then I get to Psalms and I'm reading about this Messiah. And now I get to the prophets and they're talking about this Messiah, but they're filling in a lot of details. I'm beginning to see a picture here. Let me take you to just one prophet. Prophet Isaiah kind of has the nickname of the fifth gospel. And that's because in Isaiah, we're finding out a whole lot about this Messiah who's going to come. And so as we look at this, this comes from Isaiah 53. And in this section of the prophet Isaiah's book, he's talking about the Lord's servant. And he begins to describe this servant. Let's just read this together. I've got it on the screen here. So let's just read this together. Where Isaiah writes about this servant, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, he opened not his mouth. Now I start putting that with the rest of my breadcrumbs, and I'm thinking, okay, I've got some real questions here. The one who's going to bruise the head of Satan, the one who's going to bless the earth, the one who God is going to raise up for everyone to listen to, the one who's going to be the Messiah, sounds to me like he's going to experience a great deal of trouble. And I can read all kinds of things like this in the prophets. So then, when I get to the end of the Old Testament, I've got all these dilemmas. The Old Testament has shown me a Messiah who is God, yet a Messiah who's a man. A Messiah who's going to be all powerful, yet a Messiah who's going to be a servant. A Messiah who is going to save, yet a Messiah who's going to be rejected. A Messiah who can heal, yet a Messiah who's going to die. And so I've got all of these different things going on here. And if all I had was the Old Testament, I would be left with a whole lot of questions, because these are shadows that do not reveal all of the details to me. But the good news is I'm not left there, because in the New Testament, I open it up and I'm going to see the substance of the shadows revealed. I'm going to begin to see all of these different pictures filled out now. And God is going to give me the true picture of who Jesus is all about. And so when I open up my New Testament, I come to 4 books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, oftentimes called the Gospels. But if you'll notice on the screen, in that first picture, it says the Gospel according to Matthew. And the same would be true for all of them. It's one gospel, but it's being told 4 different ways. So as soon as the New Testament opens, there are 4 men who are giving me 4 pictures of Jesus Christ. These books are going to be similar, yet they're going to be different. And that's because each of them are written to a different group of people. Let's take, for example, the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was written primarily to people who were Jews. And what Matthew is going to do is he's going to say, okay, Jews, you know all of these Old Testament books, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Messianic Psalms, all of these prophets, you know this one who they were talking about, this Messiah? I want to tell you about him. This Messiah is Jesus Christ. And so the book of Matthew is going to begin with a genealogy that would have resonated with the Jews. They would have picked up on this and they're saying, okay, we know that the Messiah is going to come through the line of David. And so Matthew, right off the bat, says, all right, let's get some family lines straight here. And then as we go through the book of Matthew, Matthew is constantly going to be bringing up prophecies that are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So here is our first picture. Here is the Jewish Messiah that is going to answer all of the questions that the Old Testament has asked. And Matthew is saying to these Jews, look, this is the one who has been prophesied. And then we come to the Gospel of Mark. And Mark is a very hurry up kind of gospel. Yet the way that Mark is written is he's seeking to convince Romans that Jesus is the Son of God. The Son of God would have been a term that would have been reserved for the Caesars. That's how they would have referred to themselves. And so the Gospel of Mark opens up kind of like the birth announcement of a king and the introduction to a king. And so Mark is being very radical for his day. He's saying, okay, I want to introduce you to a king, but not like how you think about it. I want to introduce you to the King of Kings. And so Mark really hurries up and he gets us to the final part of Jesus' life. He doesn't spend a lot of time on the birth and the early years. He says, I want to show you what makes Jesus Christ the King. And so for the Roman mind, Mark's gospel would have really resonated with them in the message that he's bringing. And then we come to the Gospel of Luke. And the Gospel of Luke demonstrates to the Greek mind that Jesus is a very logical choice. In fact, of the four Gospels themselves, Luke comes the closest to being a biography of Jesus. Luke writes in a meticulous style that takes Jesus in a linear way through his life with lots of detail. And so for one who is wanting to reason in that way, Luke is going to be the gospel that will encourage that. He begins by filling in lots of details about the birth of Jesus. And he tells us about all that's going on with Joseph and Mary and the flight that has to be taken into Egypt. So here is a very meticulous historical account. These three Gospels you may have heard referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. And simply what that means is their story, though different, has a lot of similarities, but we're not done. We then come to the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is likely written several decades after the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John is saying, I want to introduce you in a greater way to the deity of Jesus. And so the Gospel of John begins just like the book of Genesis. In the beginning, except John's going to say, was the Word. And the Word, he's going to tell us, is Jesus Christ. And so John is going to delve deeply into this relationship of God the Father and God the Son and their unity in the plan of salvation. And so we take all four of these books together, and it gives us a very clear picture of Jesus Christ. Now, we can harmonize these books, we can take them, and we can see the life of Jesus. But what I want us to understand is each of these books are written to stand alone. Each of them have a style, each of them are making points, yet all of them are bringing us to Jesus Christ. All of these books are filling in the details that we saw the shadows of back in the Old Testament. And so after I read these four Gospels, I know who the Son of God is. They have given me four word pictures of Jesus Christ. And then as I continue on in the New Testament, the remainder of the New Testament is going to explain how I live for Jesus. And so that brings us to the question, why should I live for him? When I read the Bible, I can find who Jesus is. I can see this picture of who Jesus is, but I'm still left with this question of, why should I live for him? And so in answer to that question, I simply say, stay tuned. because next Monday, Lord willing, we're going to pick up with this picture that we've seen emerging of Jesus tonight, but we're going to expand on that, and we're going to try to figure out why it is that I want to come to know Jesus, who is the way to salvation. And so I encourage you to join us again next week, and we'll develop this picture a little bit further. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight to join us in this study, and I hope it's been helpful as we've begun our venture into seeing who Jesus the way really is. So Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
This conference will now be recorded.
I still haven't mastered that recording thing.